Good afternoon. Welcome to the British Library. Welcome to the Irish Writers Weekend, our second one. My name is John Fawcett, and I look after the cultural events programme here for the British Library, and it's been absolutely thrilled to work on programming this. It was one of the most pleasurable and in some ways easiest events I've ever had to programme, because there's just so much to choose from, you know. One says no, well, there's another 10 that will say yes. So, I mean, it's such a wonderful, wonderful, rich literary culture, and we're absolutely thrilled with the writers who are joining us over the weekend. Also, huge thanks to all their supporters. Hello. Okay, somebody can't hear me. Team upstairs, if that's okay. Yeah? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Shall I start again? No. So yes, welcome to you all. I look after the cultural programme here. So I was just about to say that thank you very much once again to Culture Ireland for their amazing support for this weekend, to the Embassy of Ireland in London, and our amazing hotel partner, the Doyle Collection. Many, many other thanks to you, but I'll save you that for now. So the next session is Modern Fables. I'm really looking forward to this one. We have a fabulous panel. So Sinéad, Gleeson, Carson, and Rónán, Hession. And they'll be chaired by Barry Pearce, who's a London-based book critic for The Big Issue, and of course from an Irish background. So please do enjoy the next session.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along to the Irish Writers Weekend here in the British Library. This is a very exciting panel that I have before me. Three writers who are kind of just some of the best to come out of the island, you know, at the moment. And for this session, the title of this session is Modern Fables, and I think it's a very apt title, because when you read these kind of three novels, you notice that all three of these writers have an interest in strange things and the uncanny and slightly heightened worlds. But if you aren't wholly familiar with who is on the panel, we have Sinéad Gleeson here, who is the editor of the landmark literary anthologies, The Long Gaze Back and The Glass Shore. Her essay collection, Constellations, was named the Non-Fiction Book of the Year, the Irish Book Awards, and was shortlisted for the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. Her debut novel, Hagstone, is the haunting tale of an artist based on an island off the coast of Ireland, and is about strange occurrences on the island, I think, is the kind of pithy way of summing it up. Rónán Hession is a writer and musician based in Dublin. His debut novel, Leonard and Hungry Paul, was chosen by the Sunday Times as one of the 50 greatest Irish novels of the 21st century, which he followed up with the equally as fated Penenka. His novel, Ghost Mountain, documents a community whose lives become quite utterly altered after a mysterious mountain appears out of nowhere in the locality. And Carson is a novelist and short story writer who has had a pretty prolific career over the past 10 years, publishing 3 novels, 3 short story collections, 2 flash fiction anthologies, as well as editing an anthology of dementia-inspired fiction. Her latest collection of short stories, Quickly While They Still Have Horses, was described by RTE as being populated with characters that are as sharp and acerbic in their strangeness as they are funny and extraordinary. I am Barry Pearce. I'm a book critic and culture writer based here in London, but most importantly from Cork. I have a review column in The Big Issue, and I also write for outlets such as Dazed and ID and British GQ. Welcome, everyone, on this kind of... When I just arrived, and there was news that there may be a couple Irish writers stranded in this city because flights are being cancelled left, right, and centre, apparently, which is
this had all the hallmarks of a kidnapping from the beginning. When they said, get the 30 Irish riders from our neighbouring country, get them in London.
And put them...
It was a Trojan horse without the horse.
I also lure them specifically to the British Library as well.
Yes,
I like
exactly.
That. That's quite a nice
touch.
That's a
statement,
I want to kind of begin with a kind of a general discussion about these idea of modern fables and the kind of connection between you all of, as I said, these kind of somewhat heightened worlds. There is an element of the fable, there's an element of folklore in your work. Also, I think very predominantly an element of the supernatural, which I think is kind of woven through all of these works. And it interests me because the relationship between Irish people, Irish writers, and folklore and the supernatural is something that is taken quite seriously in Ireland. It's something you don't really see from what I've seen in the UK. The UK doesn't have that kind of same tradition of strange tales and supernatural tales and almost folkloric tales. I kind of want to begin, maybe because Sinéad, you're kind of just closest to me.
Sure.
What do you think it is about kind of Irish people and our kind of our belief in some of these tales and the kind of strangeness of it all?
I think they're very primal and they're very ancient and they're kind of very rooted in our DNA. And when I talk to people about stories, the first narrative, the first stories I ever heard before I thought I was going to be a writer were stories of folklore, mythology, Cú Chulainn, the Children of Lear. You grow up with these stories. They're the first stories you learn about in school. And they don't seem, although they're strange and about sort of transformation and about animals becoming children or children becoming animals, or things that happen in the ground, or the salmon of knowledge that you can become extremely clever by a blister on a fish, this kind of stuff. So it's all very rooted in nature. I think it's possibly connected to maybe the fact that we moved from a very pagan sort of pantheistic culture into a very Christian culture, and of course we all know how that turned out for Ireland, especially if you're a woman. So I think that is definitely a throwback to that kind of history is something that we find very sort of primal. It doesn't seem also something that you can hold sort of mythology and science they're not very divorced in Ireland. I think they're taken quite seriously in these sort of old tales. A lot of them were sort of like fairy tales. They were morality tales. They were tales about teaching you how to live a good life, a moral life, a decent life. Again, in a pre-Christian time before those parameters were there. So I think it's something we take seriously, but I think it's very late. It's also possibly linked to colonialism, this idea that they were our stories before we were taken over. So I think that's all in the mix, I think.
Rónán, why do you think we kind of believe it all? There is I think there's many parts of Ireland that have kind of somewhat wild tales associated to them, but many people have full trust in believing these tales. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because realism, there's a mismatch, I think, between people's experiential life and realism. I think, we're all obviously sitting here in a theatre, and it's obvious what's apparent. But within each of us, there's a churn of things going on, some of which we're dimly aware of, some of which we're very much aware of and perhaps concealing. So reality, observed reality versus unobservable reality, there's a massive gap between those two things. But at the individual level, I think we experience both. And I think it's very difficult to bridge that just using realist tools. I've always been struck by the painter Lucian Freud. I saw an interview with him a while back, and he was saying surrealism was originally hyphenated, surrealism, ultra-realism. So it wasn't about abandoning reality and going into like a dreamscape. It was really about what's the kind of, in a way you have to suspend certain realistic things to make conceptual leaps. In a way, it's a bit like catwalk fashion. In catwalk fashion, they suspend the wearability, the practicality, the economics of an outfit to make a conceptual leap. And then if they make the design leap, the high street translates that into something realistic. And I think it's, to some extent, the writer can do that as well, can abandon the realism, and the reader can translate that back to reality. It's why I suppose Greek myths, etc., have lasted so well. There's something transcendent about the aspects of human nature that can be explored using those sort of storytelling tools. And I think in Ireland, I think Sinead's right. Like there are gaps in our history that are filled in by folklore. There are actual real events that are retold to folklore, and people don't really sweat the fact that it's kind of mixed in together. It actually, because history, the more you think about it, is a narrative exercise. It's about putting order on chaos retrospectively. So to some extent, whatever storytelling tools get you there most vividly and most really, they should be deployed. And I think it's a mix of all that.
Mm-hmm. Jan, what do you think of the kind of Ireland as this kind of almost liminal kind of space that sometimes it seems to exist in the real world, but also in a kind of non-real world?
First of all, can I say thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be back in the British Library. And I would possibly have a slightly different experience to these two. So I was educated in a Protestant girls' school, and we didn't get any Irish mythology. So for me, it has been a retrospective journey as a writer to learn some of the things like the Ulster myth cycles. And my best friend and I sat down one night with a bottle of wine to try and remember Irish myths, or try and dredge them out from like half-heard things. And we're like, I think there's a wise trout, or it might be a salmon, and somebody with a big hurley stick. And so I don't have that same kind of ready availability to using that in my work. Mm-hmm. For me, my primary text growing up was the Bible. So I learned to tell stories from the Bible, and I always say this, and I mean it with no disrespect, but the Bible is a magical realist text. It's set in the real world, and then a lot of weird shit happens. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to a journalist from Cork about 6 weeks ago, and I said that, and he said, "What's supernatural about the Bible?" And I was like, secularism is rampant in Ireland now, this is great. So I think for me, the parable is a really interesting form, and there's, the parable is one of the primary storytelling structures within the Bible, and it often features aspects of the supernatural or the miraculous, and I love playing with that. I think the other thing that's maybe peculiar to the North is that we often feel that we're living in a kind of Beckettian landscape of absurdism. And the Argentine writer Samantha Schweblin, she talks about writing at the end of the possible. So if you are staying in a hotel room and you go back to your room and there's a ghost there, you know instantly you're in the realms of the supernatural. If you go back and there's a white horse in your hotel room, it's deeply disconcerting, but it is physically possible. Perhaps even more disconcerting than this idea of the supernatural, and that is often a good metaphor for living in Northern Ireland. It's right at the end of the possible. So absurdism goes hand in hand with the uncanny, I think.
Mm-hmm. I like that you brought up the Bible and kind of the...
I can do it more if you want quotes.
Because I think, you're right, I think there is a reluctance to classify religious events as supernatural events. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of Ireland has been shaped, the culture and the economy has been shaped and melded by religious events. If I want to kind of segue to, like, if I think about Knock, for example, and Knock, what happened there, a Marian apparition, where these...
And the moving statues.
And the moving statues, yeah. I was thinking about this, and I was like, surely those are supernatural occurrences, but we don't classify those as supernatural occurrences. We classify them as something different because there's a religious aspect.
I've said this many times when I've talked about this book, where you'll meet a farmer who's a big, sensible man with shovel hands, and he has a field that has a hawthorn tree or a fairy mound in it, and he'll be on the side of the side of science and rationality, and someone would say, "Would you not get rid of that fairy mound?" And he's like, "I'm not touching that."
Yeah,
and that's you can hold those two opposing views in Ireland. You can believe in both of those things at the same time. Be really practical, also be very religious, but believe I'm not going to mess with that fairy mound in the middle of my field.
Yeah.
So,
and there's I can't remember. motorways have been
Have skirted around them.
have been
It's true.
diverted
Yeah.
because of the thought of touching the tree where the fairies live. You know, it's like I say, they are. When you say it out loud, it's ridiculous,
I
but
know.
we take it very seriously.
Yeah.
You don't mess with the fairies in Ireland.
Yeah.
It's something you just simply don't do.
Yeah.
you
And
know?
there's weird kind of, I don't know whether you call them kind of opposing things going on in the Protestant culture as well, where when I was writing the Raptures, I interviewed a lot of the Presbyterians that I grew up with, rural men, a bit like the shovel hand at men that Sinead's talking about. And I'm from a particular branch of theology that's cessationist, so they believe that the age of miracles is over. So they won't even pray for healing. It's all about kind of whatever God's will be done. And yet they were telling me stories about cures that people had. And so the miraculous is held in tension with the magical all the time. And that's such an interesting place to write, which you do really well, like right into that space between the religion and the non-religious magic.
Yeah. It's not even just folk tales and fairy tales. I'm reading Deborah Levy's new book, which is great, and she talks about J.G. Ballard. And, you know, he got bracketed all the time as a science fiction writer, where a lot of the things he was writing about were political and hyper-realist, but he got shoved into this kind of, oh, you're writing weird things about cars. That must be science, you must be science fiction and stuff. So also genre is can be a problem. The things that are genre are on the periphery, are not in the centre of literary fiction, are often kind of people are quick to box them in and say that they're something else, they're other, they're unheimlich, and they're not actually dealing with really quite actual day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, I get that. I want to, once again, since you're beside me, Sinead,
Sure.
I want to kind of talk about Hagstone. But before that, I'd love if you could maybe just like give a little kind of background to the novel and then maybe read from it as well. If
Sure. This is a novel about an artist called Nell. She makes a very specific kind of art. It's performance art, land art, durational art. So art that is very tricky to make a living from. By nature of its ephemerality, if you like, and it's the fact that it's on the ground and you can't stick it in a gallery and sell it. But that's the kind of work she likes to make. It's very large scale. She makes kind of installations. She lives on a remote island. It's 12 hours from the coast of Ireland. We don't have one of them, so it's a made-up island. She lives very precariously. She gets involved with a man on the island who's a returning islander, and then later an actor. But the main thrust of the novel, I think, is there's a group of women who've kind of cut themselves off from the world called the Innies, which is the Irish for the daughters, and they're rejecting capitalism and patriarchy and just the kind of the rush and hyper digital world we're all in, and just said, no, I'm just going to live somewhere else. So they commissioned a piece from her. But I might read a piece that on an island, Nell is also a voyeur. So on an island where there's not many people, there's kind of slim pickings, if you've, especially if you've been with a lot of the island, as she has. So I'm going to read a little bit, which is about desire in that space. The man, she meets this man, Cleary, he's the returning islander, and she has this idea for a project, a durational piece in a lighthouse. That's the only thing you really need to know about it. In a remote place, desire is complicated. Everyone in their 20s from here to New York just wants to drink, party, fuck. Nell, a decade on, sees this part of her life is heading for the rearview mirror. Memories of parties in the island's forest that went on all weekend. A rollover of pills and lighting cigarettes the wrong way round. Dancing for 6 hours, feeling the bass jump in her body. A steady stream of hungry men. The flip side for others meant that a small pool of people led to unreciprocated lust and frustration. That night, outside Cleary's, she's peeping in the window, she wonders which of the local women he's been with. Who is his first? How many? She's been with a lot of island men, on the beach, in damp bedrooms. Their lives don't interest her, their hopes, her habits, the things they want, but each has told her things. Who owed money, who liked booze too much, which women wouldn't allow their husbands to touch them. And she feels pity, disdain too, that they can't find a way out of that lack of connection. And every time she's on top of someone or men have leaned in, climbing her body like a cliff, she feels a pang for their unfuckedness. Cleary's curtains are open, or maybe there aren't any, given the perfunctory state of the dwelling. All heat from the stove lost through the glass. He's burning through logs at some rate, the idiot. On the table are coloured gel filters, the kind some local lads use on lamps when hunting hares. This presents a possible unexpected conversation opener. Hello, I've been gawping in your window unbeknownst to you, but hey, could I have some of those gel filters for an art project in a lighthouse? Thank you. Each night, something new about him reveals himself. The accelerated blink rate, as if trying to understand something cryptic. The angle of his nose, Roman, aquiline. His stubble, a scouring of black points on his chin. Eyes closed, she imagines it brushing her lips, her face, her thighs. An image of teenage hunger and beard rash. A petroleum scald on the groin. Cleary opens a beer, a kithog, left-handed, something they used to try and beat out of the kids in the local school. The room is sparse, a boxy television, a shelf with a handful of what look like manuals or maps. By the fire, underwear and a woolen jumper cling to a lopsided clothes horse. She experiences a sudden and inexplicable sadness, not for him or about him, but for herself. That despite the accumulation of years, life isn't where it could be. The fact that she always feels the right answer is just out of reach. Would he be disgusted or turned on by this lurking? He might even be impressed at the discipline, the commitment. Distracted, she steps back, sensing the misstep too late. Connecting with the recycled empties by the back door, the sound a klaxon. Shit. He turns quickly, alert, listening. By the time he's up out of the chair, Nell is gone. Years from now, she imagines herself visiting an expensive therapist in a city far from here, sitting in an elegant red brick house on a tree-lined street. Actual art, not print reproductions, framed on mallard green walls, a single delicate orchid in a pot in the hall. Did you think deep down that you wanted to be caught? Of course not, she would reply. I didn't want him to think I was a fucking degenerate. Well, maybe just a bit.
Thank you for that. I want to know when did Hagstone first appear in your life? When did it kind of all begin?
Oh, a really long time ago. I'm embarrassed to say how long ago. And that's the thing about novels, they take a really long time in that I think you have to stay in them. I think they're very immersive projects. If you go off and do other things, and I was, working on anthologies, having children, writing constellations, and I never got a run at it. And I many times I thought, I will never finish this. I just thought, but it was ultimately Nell's story because she's very tethered to the island, but it's a difficult place to live. It's quite inhospitable, and yet her art is rooted there and her love of the place is there. But it's easier. Most people leave these kind of difficult places, and I think that a lot of the conflict in the book is whether she will stay and she will go. So I kind of did actually, and people talk about their characters like they're real people, and I used to kind of roll my eyes a little at that, and yet I could hear her all the time, and wondering what was going to happen. So yeah, it was always the island. There's a sound that some people can hear on this island. She was always an artist, and there was Nell and Cleary, and that was it. The innings actually came much later, to be honest.
Oh, are they? But they're such a kind of intrinsic part of it.
Yeah,
That's quite
that's the thing about brains. They're kind of annoying. You're convinced you're writing on path A, and then I was a good bit of the way in, and I had this image one day I was like hanging at the washing, something. So it's great when you're doing really banal things, and that's where things come to you sometimes. And I saw this image of a group of women all wearing very similar clothing, and they were standing in the sea with their arms linked, and they were singing. And I just thought, who are they?
Yeah.
And I just ran back in, and that was, and I realise now that's a part of a much bigger scene later on that I had no idea of. And so sometimes your unconscious is doing the spade work that you don't yet know about. So yeah, they came quite late, but I'm glad they did show up.
It is quite interesting that you have this kind of like a reclusive colony of women, which in the book are very real women, very kind of normal women. But that is a group of which you can feel that someone would attach some sort of strange supernatural kind of story to. As history has kind of shown, if a group of women get together, they must be performing some sort of witchcraft or something
Absolutely.
like that.
Or you take the idea of the crone or the hag or the woman in the woods, the woman who didn't want to get married, who didn't want to have children, like Nell doesn't. But has gifts around, with making pastes and unguents and maybe has a cure for shingles or whatever it is. And because she chooses to, seed from the gendered norms and what's expected of her and the broader world, whatever that is, people think she's weird. So she's probably a witch. She's a crazy mad lady. So there is that. If you don't conform, you get tarred with that kind of brush. And I think that's happened to lots of women. And in this case, these women are from all over the world. Some are running from things. Some just like the idea of not having to opt into the rat race that we're all part of.
Yeah.
And there's something very alluring about that, just abandoning your life and going to live with it. And again, I suppose I wanted to write about power because in those groups, even in very egalitarian spaces, somebody always wants to be more in charge. And that's where some of the problems happen in the book.
You set the novel in like you say, on an island, miles and miles off the coast of Ireland. It's a place that doesn't exist. In my mind, that kind of brings to mind, this kind of, High Brazil, the kind of myth of High Brazil, which, if for those of you who don't know, for many years, it was believed that there was kind of a mystical
Under the sea.
island, basically, somewhere far in the Atlantic off the coast of Ireland. And it made its way onto many medieval maps. People genuinely believe this place existed. But it's completely made up.
Yeah.
Your island kind of, I don't know if you've purposefully kind of referenced that or...
I wanted it to be a place that was hard to get away from. And there's like 503 islands off the coast of Ireland. And if I set it on Doolin and you could get the ferry home in 40 minutes, end of novel. It wouldn't really work. So I wanted to be a kind of, I'm thinking more like Orkney or Shetland, which are those 12-hour ferries from Aberdeen. It's a difficult place. And I've said this many times, but when you're writing fiction or you're writing essays, you're always, I think, asking a question of your characters, which is what is the container of the story? And what that is what can your character not escape from? So that could be a relationship. It could be bereavement or grief. It could be, lost love. It can be a geographical space like this is. And I think Nell, her art is so rooted in this space, she's thinking, maybe I won't make this kind of work if I live somewhere else. So it had to be somewhere that was hard to get away from and not easy to eke out a living or a job there. So you have to really want to live in a place like that, which she does, because she feels that's where the source of her inspiration comes from, I think.
Yeah. And also quite just the idea of a quite desolate island in the middle of the ocean. Automatically you kind of think weird things are happening there.
Yeah, because they can be lawless kind of spaces. I mean, if you talk to anybody on any of the islands, and I've been to lots of the Irish islands, most of them don't have there's no police presence. So there's a social contract there that you're going to look out for people, you're going to mind people. I did an event with Molly Hennigan, the writer, and she lives on the Aran Islands, and she was saying for the first 2 years, the islanders wouldn't speak to her and her partner because they think you're not going to stick it out, you're not going to last. It's really hard here. And yet when lockdown happened, then there was an island-wide WhatsApp group where people looked out for each other and people who were cocooning, and there was this kind of beautiful sort of thing happened. And that's the thing, islands can be beautiful sort of egalitarian spaces, but they can also be very claustrophobic, and everybody knows what time you left the pub or who's going out with who. There's not a lot of privacy in spaces like that. So that seemed like a really interesting place to set a novel for me.
I want to know more about the hum, because there's throughout the book there is this kind of hum or noise, or like this, people can hear a noise that is completely unexplained. And actually, I think somewhat coincidentally, I think there's a show on that's just started on the BBC.
I haven't seen it yet. The listeners, I'm really wondering.
Yeah, I can call the listeners, which is about exactly this genuine kind of phenomenon that kind of tends to happen all around the world, where people can just hear this noise with no explanation, no obvious source. Why did you? What intrigued you about the hum?
There's loads of hums all over the world, and I had first heard about one in Kerry, and it was actually, I heard one of the Healy Rays, these Irish politicians, on the radio talking about it.
That's the first mention of them in the British Library.
I know, I'm sure. They're all going to get elected next Friday anyway. But they were one of them was talking about it, and I'd heard I think there's one around Newcastle as well in the UK. There's lots of different examples of it, and again, I was interested in that idea. In the same way that I was in Constellations, there are people who can see ghosts or sense things, and some people can't. And who are those people? And what is the register? And maybe, or is it because you're artistic or creative, or I don't know, just more in tune? So this idea is a real thing, that some people can hear this sound. There's cases of people who've gone mad from it. You just can't. And it's not tinnitus, it's not any of those things, but it's just, so I think it's the idea of the unexplained, and why some people's register is there for those things and other people's aren't. So it seemed to me, again, if you go to some place, like I went to Dungeness yesterday, which is a place I've always wanted to go, where Derek Jarman's cottage is, and it was incredibly stormy, but also there's just an atmosphere and a sound and a space in certain places, especially literal places by the sea, and it made sense to me that this remote island would have a sound like that.
It's a very oppressive thing, I find.
Yeah, when you notice something in a room or air conditioning, and then you can't unhear it, it's a very distracting, intrusive thing.
You quite, especially with the hum, you literally can't escape it.
No.
It's again with this idea of being on the island. Not only these people on the island, some people are on the island and hearing the hum. It's kind of like double oppression. It's quite it's quite.
It adds to the sense of the inescapable in this place, and that's one of the things it was a real driver for the book. This is a hard place to leave. You can, not just because it's strange, but because, or that it's distant, but because Nell is so umbilically connected to it, and she loves it for many reasons. So it's harder to leave a place like that for any of us, your hometown or your small town or whatever it is.
do you feel at home in fiction now? If this is your debut novel, you've been kind of working at it for many years, but obviously you have a career as an essayist and an arts journalist and a critic. How was the experience of actually finally getting to sit down and just kind of make it all up? You know,
a nightmare. Can I say that? It's really fiction's. A novel's a big engine. There's they're very hard, I think. And the thing about essays is that or maybe Jan might think the same about the short story, though I think they're harder in many different ways. Something that's 10, 12 pages, when it's not working out with an essay and maybe with a short story, or you get stuck, you can put it away in a drawer and work on something else. But with novels, I think you literally have to be in the bunker with it. But I also think because they're big, they're accommodating. You can do an awful lot of things with them. And I do think, I say many times the essays are very bendy and malleable form, but also they're short, and there's a certain amount of things you have to hit and get through. So novels can be, I really liked it. I definitely feel, and I don't know if other writers feel this, but I think they're left and right brain fiction, non-fiction. They don't feel like they come from the same place at all. For me, I feel like different muscles in the brain are kind of working when I do both. But I do, yeah. So it's not the last novel for sure.
I hope not.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead.
Thank you, Barry.
Rónán, it's your time in the hot seat now.
I admired Sinead's restraint when she said there are 500 islands off the coast of Ireland, and didn't add, and we're on one of them now.
You can't say, people say mainland. Can't say that anymore.
Ghost Mountain, I'd love if you could, again, just do a little introduction to the novel and maybe read just a short section from it.
Sure. So Ghost Mountain is a mountain that appears suddenly. And there are a cast of characters that live in the area. There's the town drunk, there's a retired art teacher, there's a couple, one of whom was an old soul and one of whom was a young soul. And their lives go into change. It's not entirely clear how that's linked to the appearance of Ghost Mountain itself. And Ghost Mountain, it's said throughout the book that Ghost Mountain is Ghost Mountain. So it resists the reader's temptation to project onto it or to make a metaphor or a symbol of it. And that's quite important to what the book's trying to do. There are two main themes, I think. And I can say this now, that the book came out in May, and I'm only now, this is actually my last sort of Ghost Mountain event, and it's only now I'm sort of starting to see the book clearly and kind of going, oh, that's what it's about. So I think the two of the main themes, one is I think that issue of projection. So we all carry around a sense of self. I carry around a Rónán, a Sinead, a Barry, Jan, so on, that we don't have full visibility of. And we resolve that in our lives by trying to project it into the world, and to some extent hoping it'll be validated or at least recognized, which doesn't happen. And that sort of leaves us in this sort of slightly unconsummated state in terms of our sense of self. So continually the characters externalize who they are, unsuccessfully. And I think the other aspect of it is about the sort of, I kind of sense that in a lot of, I think since I became a writer, which isn't that long, it's about 5 or 6 years ago, and reviewing books and paying more attention to how they're made, I've kind of pulled back from, but something that's really strong, I think, in American fiction was a real kind of cause and effect rationale. And particularly when people are trying to understand themselves. So people almost get to the point where, they need to understand their past in order to move on. And I think when I turned 40, I'm 48 now, when I turned 40, I started thinking, if at 40 I'm still making sense of my childhood, mathematically I'm going to run out of time. I will not get there by the time, I die at 100, which is my current plan. And so you don't, so what actually is driving you? And there's so much undercurrent, there's so much mystery in terms of what makes up your sort of consciousness. And I began to sort of understand that the sort of presence of absence was a huge part of it. That the extent to which we carry absence in our lives is really important. And the bit I'm going to read is about grief, actually. I think, especially since I started reviewing books, I know you review books professionally as well. So my certain sense is that grief is probably the dominant topic of our time, in terms of literature. And when I started to try and compare it to my own experience of grief, I lost my father when I was young, and I've been with certain people in their final hours over the last few years, that I sort of sense there's been a drift of fiction away from what life is actually like. There's kind of an artificial sweetener of poignancy in it. And it's almost like grief is a moment. The thing about grief, I find, is that it's chaotic. It's over a long time. It's noisy. And that it goes on while everything else in life goes on. Unlike movies, you don't get to kind of grieve, by the seaside. Have a quiet time in a cottage and then rejoin humanity. It's something you're continually wrestling with. So I started thinking about grief in terms of not as a sort of getting over death, but as a continuity. So the book is spread over 25 years. It's 3 books, book 1, 2, 3, which I always say is, it's extremely good value. 25 years, 25 years, 3 books. Hard to knock it. But what that allows you to do, it means that you're the reader is still in the same space, but the component ingredients are changing. So instead of seeing, again, Barry's life, Sinead's life, Rónán's life, John's life, you're seeing life, capital L, reshaping itself. There'll be another festival like this next year. There'll be different writers, different interviewers, different people, but it will still be the same festival. So that reshaping. So I'm just going to read a short section, which is in the middle of the book. There are a couple of kind of spoilers in this, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. I don't think it'll spoil your reading. And in any event, the book's been out for 6 months now. I can't wait forever. This is called Ocho. This is the beginning of the second book. Ocho would never experience grief until his parents and his wife died suddenly. Before then, he was only dimly aware of what grief was exactly. Nothing about the presence of Ruth and his parents in his life had prepared him for their absence. To be precise, Ocho was experiencing 3 griefs. Each grief had its own characteristics. The grief for his father was dulling. This reflected the fact that he and his father had a largely unexpressed relationship. That is not to say they weren't close, merely that they could spend time together and communicate without words. They recognized that much can flow between 2 people if you simply let it. Back and forth, a mutually sustaining flow. But this meant that the loss of his father was incommunicable. Without his father, there was no flow. Without flow, there was no stagnation. This is dulling grief. It sapped his appetites and sedated his instinct for social contact. This made it a long-form grief. It was the type of grief that a person often found hard to break alone. The grief for his mother was based on warmth. Specifically, it is the warmth that supports a person or on which they lie. If the covers are swept from a sleeping child, they will complain about the cold. However, as their body feeds heat to the mattress beneath them, which will hold and return that heat, they will go back to sleep and have warm, loving dreams. It is the warmth beneath them, rather than the warmth above, that makes the love in their dreams possible. But if the child tries sleeping on a cold floor with a warm blanket, they will end up with unshakable cold and loveless dreams. This is what losing his mother felt like to Ocho. She not only fed him love, but held on to the love he gave her, preserved it, and fed it back to him. It was like when he lived at home and his mother demanded that he hand up half his wages as his contribution to the household expenses. He resented this at the time, but when he moved out, his mother returned to him all the money he had handed up. The moral of that lesson was lost on him, but nevertheless, his mother's love worked in the same way. All the love he had given her, including the love he expressed to her because it had nowhere else to go, she had minded for him until he needed it. This warmed his life. Since her death, he simply could not get warm, no matter how many layers he added to his life. This is not the type of grief a person gets over. This type of grief you can only adapt to. You can never again find that sustaining warmth, the type of warmth you can sleep on. It then becomes your turn to store other people's warmth for them until they need it. But that comes much later. It comes much later because this is only possible once you are sure in your mind and heart that you know the difference between storing someone else's love and love that is yours. Ocho's grief for Ruth was fundamentally different from anything he experienced for his father and mother. He and Ruth were like two sides of the same ladder. Her death was a sundering of the ladder down the middle. Holding one half of a ladder is in no way comparable to holding one side of a complete ladder. At every level of him, for each step, there was a counterpart that was missing. That is why a person suffering from this kind of grief can fall over. It was true that all this knowledge was somewhere inside Ocho. But if you had stopped him in the street and asked him how his grief worked, you would not be talking to the part of Ocho that understood those things. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rónán. I want to talk about the sense of place in the book, because unless I read it completely wrong, which is possible, it's not set anywhere. Like, you don't give a clue of where this kind of community is based or where this mountain appears. Why did you kind of set it in this kind of, sometimes it feels like a netherworld almost, that the events kind of take place?
Yeah, like, none of my books are actually set anywhere. They're not specifically located. And I think one of the reasons for that is my main focus really is on aspects, or what seem to me to be kind of slippery or subtle aspects of human nature. And what happens is that if you locate a book in a particular place, you need to create that place. You need to give the people a relationship to it. And that takes up a certain amount of the headspace and the personality of the book. And what I really wanted to do, I realized that over the course of the 3 books, what I think I'm most interested in, and it's kind of news to me as much as anyone else, is people in transition. You know, I think people are at their most interesting. A lot of, you know, Western writing is very conflict-based. And I actually think people are more interesting when they're in transition, where they're between states. They are about to become something else, but they're not, that hasn't solidified. So really, I suppose what has changed in my previous book and this one is that I have tried to put a bit more work into creating a geography and a sort of arena for that to happen. And obviously, Ghost Mountain as a mountain is particularly prominent in the middle of it. But it also doesn't necessarily perform, you know, it doesn't really pass the audition as a sort of landscape, in a sense. It doesn't provide the setting, the reference points, the locale, the vocabulary, and all that you might expect to go with a choice of a mountain like that. So it is intended to be, I won't say enigmatic. I think what it's actually, because it's not disguising what it is. I think in storytelling, I just felt it was important. It's very, there's a character called Ursula in the book who's a painter, and she can't see Ghost Mountain. It's in front of her, but she can't capture because she can't really see it. And one of the things about mountains, and it was very hard to find a good cover, actually. This cover is by a Cork artist called Tom Clement. And I spent about 2 years looking for a good mountain painting. And the problem with a lot of mountain paintings is they treat mountains as something kind of intermediate. So mountains as a symbol of something else. Timelessness, oh, it makes me feel so small, awesomeness, etc. So you're not really seeing the mountain. You're seeing the mountain as a signpost or something else. So I wanted the Ghost Mountain in the landscape to sort of, if you like, constantly bounce people back to their lives. To not to accept, not to absorb the projection that they were putting onto it. Because there are lots of moments where, you know, the characters almost turn to Ghost Mountain or seek some sort of reaction or some to fit it into the narrative, and it continually stays outside that. And I think that kind of, I actually find that almost comforting in a way. I remember when I was, because you're asking Sinead where did the idea come from for Hagstone. I think when I think about where this first came from, about 10 or 12 years ago, I was working in the Department of Finance during the Troika process. You know, it was a very, very busy time, very stressful. My kids were very young. And every morning I'd be walking to the train and I'd see Howth Head. If anyone knows Dublin, Howth Head is on the north side. And it would look different every day. And no matter what I was going through, it kind of didn't care. It didn't partake in it. And it was kind of important to me almost every day to see it and to see its kind of non-participation. And actually, you can sort of see that as kind of a rejection or a kind of lonely thought, but I actually liked the solidity of that, you know.
Early on in the novel, just after the mountain kind of just appears, it kind of, this kind of group of people become somewhat obsessed with it, and the mountain has these kind of acolytes, and my reading of it is I couldn't help but see that almost religiously. This thing appears, and the first thing, even though it's suggested it's a modern society, the first thing they do is worship it. You know, they're like, we don't understand it, so therefore it must be our God. You know, is that what you were kind of trying to do there, or what was the?
Yeah, I think what cycles through the book in the early stages, the first book is very much around reacting to the appearance of the mountain, and so over thousands of years, mountains have acquired or have thrust upon them spiritual significance in many cultures, you know, including in Ireland. You know, you think Croagh Patrick, exactly.
Yeah.
People go up it, and so I thought that, you know, to some extent, there's a degree of misdirection in the book because, you know, I've had a few people start the book and kind of go, I know where this is going. You know, at the end the mountain disappears or something. You know, this kind of stuff, and I'm like, wait and see. So I think to some extent, you know, people are carrying around, it's really, we were talking earlier about secularism. It's interesting to me how willing people are to worship. You know, you see it in politics, you see it in celebrity. There just seems to be some instinct to worship that mystifies me, really. And I kind of felt that would be a kind of an understandable social reaction to this, that people would begin to just circumnavigate the mountain. That they would walk around it, they would develop. And Ruth, who's the old soul I mentioned earlier, she makes a reference at one point to the fact that people sort of brought their own stuff to the mountain. You know, she could see that people who were doing that had other stuff going on in their heads and their lives, and they were just almost fly tipping that emotional stuff around the mountain. But she's a purer glimpse of it, which she doesn't quite fully get. But she stays outside that. So I think it is. But then, as the book progresses, the mountain almost goes to anonymity.
Yeah.
You know, so it doesn't. I didn't want to write a sort of a satirical undermining of people's beliefs, because actually I do actually understand. Like the older I get, you know, I'm less forthright about what's solid and what's not in life. So I'm not religious in a conventional sense, but you know, I can see why the human psyche goes that way.
And this idea of a mountain that kind of just appears, is it kind of based in any sort of like actual mythology, or is it something that just came to you? Is there some sort of, did something allegedly similarly happen somewhere in the world?
No, it was just a thought I had. Just a thought I had, came out of nowhere. Actually, funny enough, it got reviewed, and someone sent me a Facebook message, a guy in the States. He said, "Congratulations on your book, but I've been working for 3 or 4 years on a book where a mountain appears suddenly, and I'm devastated." I felt very sorry for him. No, it's an awful thing to happen. And I said to him, well, you know, you should still do your book. And actually, you know, it's not that important. But no, it never, I don't know. Do you know what's funny? I've done 3 books now, and I can't really clearly remember either how I come up with the beginnings or the endings in any of them. So I think there is a sort of sense of, I suppose that's how inspiration works. It's a break in the circuit of the synapses. It's not a normal thought pattern. It's just an intervention that comes in. But once the picture was there, it was really clear. Like it was, like the way I write is really that there's just this delivery of just this really clean white energy that I just know is book-shaped, book-sized. And ride that. So, and it'd be flashes of images, but I just know it's just going to be enough.
You have just reminded me that when I was working on this book, maybe 2016, I went to a residency on Inisheer, which is the smallest of the 3 Aran Islands, and it's the most westerny arts space, Aurasena. And there's a big glass window, and you can look out and see Inishmaan, which is the middle island, and the weather is like insanely changeable. And it was literally like that. You would look out and the island would be there, and you would blink and look, and it would be gone again. And it happened multiple times a day. It's like, island's there, island's not. And it wasn't a cloud. It was just, I don't know what it was, but it was like literally this disappearing and reappearing island all the time. It was quite spooky, actually. But meteorological, obviously, but...
If you have a mountain in your life or an island in your life and actually look at it every day, they are different every day. You know, we see them as timeless. You see them in photographs, you think they're set, but they're hugely sort of changeable. And of course, this is teased out in the book as well. You are changed, so this is kind of a very dynamic thing. But there is kind of just a sudden visitation of these things, and you kind of don't question it too much in a way.
Your first 2 books, I would describe as somewhat kind of realist. You know, they're very kind of based in their own kind of worlds. And with this one, you go into this kind of like otherworldly kind of this area. Were you in any way kind of like apprehensive about going from somewhat strictly realist fiction into a kind of more malleable kind of world?
Yeah, I wasn't. I'm lucky. My publisher is very good in the sense that, you know, Kevin Duffy at Blue Moose is a small publisher in West Yorkshire, and Kevin's rule is you can do whatever you want, just it better be good, right? So there's no. My 3 books are different. They're different subject matter. So there's a lot of sort of freedom there. So so I never really sort of think about how it's going to look at the other end. There was one point I remember meeting a friend for lunch and kind of going, I think my new book is just really boring. I'm really enjoying it, but I think it might be one of those kind of enjoyingly boring books. Now, it did kind of sort itself out. But I think I do sort of have confidence in the things that strike me as powerful, that it will work. Like, I think, for example, a Turner painting, right? Mm-hmm. If you see any of the paintings at Turner where he's painting the sun, or just anything, skies, which he, you know, does light so brilliantly, it's much more vivid. If you look up close, it's really abstract. You know, you can't really see the penmanship or the drawing or the draftsmanship behind it. But when you stand back, it looks way more real than a straight realist depiction. And I remember carrying that thought with me a bit and thinking, that's how you have to do it. Reality, you almost become desensitized to reality because you've seen it so often. So to actually, for it to have impact, you have to kind of come in at a strange angle. So I was happy to do that. And I was quite spontaneous with it. I wrote, they're short chapters, like, you know, you'll see there's this kind of single page chapters and stuff, and short sentences. Like, I wrote in short bursts, and I would write, ration myself to 1 or 2. My first 2 books I wrote at night, like 10 to midnight, 6 nights a week, 3 or 4 months. Month off, same again, month off, same again. Whereas this, I just rationed myself to say 2 writing slots a week. And I would do what I've been describing as kind of heron writing, which is basically, I would sit at my computer and I would wait and 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 wait, and then write really quickly. And the logic of that was, I know from my music days that you sort of develop a certain amount of technical competence that's actually inimical to your creativity, where you can say, oh, I know how this works, I can see this, yeah, that goes there, that's there. So I wanted to let my sort of training or habits subside and get in and out right really, really quickly. And that allowed me to be spontaneous, and also I'd use something from the day. So it's just a random thing from the day. Like, say, for example, I noticed you've injured your foot, I hope it's okay, by the way. But I might put that in, you know, if I was writing today, I would put that in somehow, just to stop my habits taking over. So I didn't sweat the strangeness of it too much. And the more, I remember going back through the book, and even when I was reading that bit, I kind of pinch myself, I can feel myself getting emotional. So that kind of makes me think, okay, that energy's on the page, you know, that worked out. So I kind of felt, yes, it's strangeness, but it's purposeful and trying to penetrate people's familiarity, to get past that, to catch them out.
Thank you so much, Rónán.
Thank you.
Jan, you've been waiting patiently and quietly at the very end there. My introduction to you was through The Raptures, which is your previous novel. You haven't had a novel since, and this is now your latest short story collection. But of all the writers here, you are the one who seems to be somewhat most drawn, and over your career most drawn to kind of magical elements, kind of stories that are grounded in reality, but there is some sort of kind of something slightly off, or some sort of element to it that is perhaps not so set in the real world. What kind of draws you to writing stories and novels like that?
I don't think anything particularly draws you to a way of writing. You just write the way you write.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what happens on stage and a lot of what happens over this weekend is retrospective musing about what we do.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a very naturalistic way that you sit down and you write a story in the way that you write them. I'm always saying to my students, like, there's no one way of writing. It's about finding out what works for you. And so when I came to write, I guess I probably had the Bible in my head, and that's how I'm a firm believer that everybody has what I call a primary storytelling language. You know, and it could be Irish mythology, it could easily be Greek mythology, it could be your uncle who gets drunk at weddings and tells really good anecdotes. But it shapes how you shape a story. So when I sat down to write, I wrote like this. And then it was the poet Sinéad who slapped me over the head with a copy of Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum and said, "I think you're a magical realist, read that." And I did, and I was like, yeah, I think there's a name for what I am. And I retrospectively went back and learnt about magical realism and the elements of it and the history of it, and felt pretty comfortable there.
Mm-hmm. Could you kind of introduce the new collection of stories a bit, and maybe if you would like to just read a short section.
So there are 16 stories in here. I'm not a short story writer, so it is to my great horror that I realise I've published 5 short story collections at this point. Definitely a novelist, but I am a novelist who gets very easily distracted. I heard Sarah Moss say a few months ago that the short story is the adultery genre, and I love that. They feel to me like something I cheat with. So I'll be supposed to be working on a novel, and these 16 stories were written across the process of writing The Raptures, The Firestarters, and my new novel, Few and Far Between. And you can kind of mark the period of my obsessions as to what the stories are obsessed with. We came to put them together at about the same time as the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and we had 25 stories to whittle down to 16. So we were looking for a theme to pull them all together, and the theme which emerged is the desperately unsexy theme of disappointment. So here you're going to meet people who are at points in their life where life hasn't perhaps worked out the way they wanted it to. And they're small disappointments, like queuing in the garden centre for a fruit scone and the bastard in front of you takes the last fruit scone. Those who are laughing have been there and understand that disappointment. And then there's also bigger disappointments. There's a story that I love called In the Car with the Rain Coming Down, where a couple have been trying for years to have a baby, and they get pregnant at last, and they're about to announce this to the family at a family picnic, and the brother gets in and says, "We're pregnant," beforehand, and just steals the thunder. And that's also a disappointment in a way. But there are also bigger structural stories about disappointment, structural disappointment in Northern Ireland. I was 18 in 98 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And if you've seen that episode of Derry Girls, you will know the excitement and the kind of hope and the potential it was knocking around. We were all buying that things can only get better single. We were all imagining that it would be a utopia within the next 10 years, and it is far from a utopia there. It's a lot better than it was when I was growing up, but we still have 91% of our schools segregated. 91%, and I hate saying the statistic, but I always say it. It costs us £600,000 a day to keep our kids segregated. That's over £500,000 of wasted money a day. So that is not the utopia that we were sold. So there are stories in here questioning that structural disappointment that lingers in Northern Ireland. It's also quite a funny book. I haven't sold it like that at all. Do you want a bit of it?
Absolutely.
Right, so just to be thrown, I'm not actually going to read a magical bit. I'm going to read one of the kind of more realist stories that is happening at the end of Possibility that I talked about at the start. So the kind of stories fall into half and half, supernatural and end of Possibility stories. This one is about a thing called Press Photograph of the Year, which I got to see the exhibition of in Amsterdam just before lockdown, and I actually saw this year's one in Vitoria in the Basque Country about 2 weeks ago. These journalists have been sent to get the background story behind the 6 photographs that are the chosen 6 press photographs of the year. And this poor chap has not got to the meeting quick enough and has ended up with the Belfast story, which is an image of a burning baby being thrown over a peace wall during the riots. It's a cheery story. Cool, you say? I cover the burning baby shot. You lift the Belfast photo off the table. You've seen it 100 times before. The boys with football scarves wound round their mouths, the peace line looming in the foreground, the adults flanking either side, the baby temporarily suspended overhead. It looks like a comet or a shooting star, hot red flames trailing from its toes. You look again, resisting the urge to romanticize. It mostly looks like a petrol bomb. It's a cracking photo, 10 times more interesting than Kate Middleton. Now, says the editor, you all know the drill. 2,000 words on the story behind the photograph. Get over there, talk to the people on the street, give me something new, an angle we haven't covered yet. You should be thanking your lucky stars. You're all working with actual humans this year. Larissa glances at you confused. It's her first press photograph of the year gig. You lean over to whisper, last year, Simone got lumbered with the polar bear on the melting iceberg. You know that shot? Larissa nods sympathetically. Tough gig, she says. Okay, says the editor, dismissing the 5 of you with a queenly wave. Off you all go. Copy deadlines midnight on Thursday. Try not to get yourselves killed. And off you go. First to your desk where your emergency rucksack is stashed. You keep the essentials packed and ready. Passport, toothbrush, pants and pen. Packet of Tetley in case they send you overseas. You train to Gatwick, booking a flight on the EasyJet app, $49.99. You do the sums. It's significantly cheaper than a train ticket home. Why isn't everybody going to Belfast? Why indeed? You only book one way for now. You've no idea how you'll get on with the locals. They're a grim-looking breed when they're on the telly. Not unlike the Glasgow contingent, and you know firsthand it's pure torture getting Glaswegians to talk to the press. If this lot are forthcoming, you could be in and out in a single day. If not, you're looking at a budget hotel. Expenses won't stretch to a fancy place. It'll be an Ibis, a Premier Inn, or a travel lodge. It is impossible not to feel tragic waking up in a travel lodge. It's the showers that wreck you, the single wall-mounted dispenser of shampoo, conditioner and shower gel in one. You prefer to treat your hair and genitals as separate entities. It's a basic dignity thing. Belfast is ugly from the air. The city's a greyscape of building sites, the loch a hungry gulping mouth. You pick out the cranes, 2 yolk yellow staples squatting on the water's edge. A green pond park swims up to meet you. The airplane judders, and just like that, you're on the ground. The airport's provincial, to say the least. It is chiefly constructed from porta-cabins and corrugated tin. Inside's rocking a 90s leisure centre aesthetic, back when primary's colours were in. The walls are lined with floor-to-ceiling Game of Thrones stills and advertisements for those yellow crisps. Shots of Rory McIlroy swinging away, all pixelated, all dog-earing at the corners where the laminate's peeling off. It's like stepping back in time, though not far enough to be considered charming. It's simply out of date. You show the taxi driver the photo on your mobile. You know it's not a real baby, he says. Of course I know, you reply. People don't set real babies on fire. The taxi driver doesn't reply.
Thank you so much for that, Jan. I'm kind of glad you read that bit, because I do want to talk to you about, as you mentioned, you write about some fairly kind of serious stuff, but in a very comical tone. How do you find that balance?
I'm just very funny. I'm not actually. I just think it is an Irish thing, and we often get asked about the kind of balance of darkness and humour in writing, and I think all of us do it to some extent, and some of us, like Kevin Barry, have become absolute masters of doing that. And to me, it often comes down to a couple of things. One, I think, is hospitality. I think the Irish are, by nature, a very hospitable breed. They can't bear a silence. They will talk at you in the lift, whether you want to be talked at or not. They will try and welcome you into their house with food. And that principle extends to saying something that might upset you. So if you're going to deliver a line that upsets the equilibrium and leaves somebody reeling, you probably need to undercut that pretty quickly with something that makes them feel okay about the world again, and humour does that really well. I think also humour can be a coping mechanism, and I've thought about this a lot in the context of this book, that we used humour a lot in the North when we're talking about difficult stuff and things that would otherwise make you cry, probably. And sometimes that's absolutely brilliant, and sometimes actually we need to stop doing that, because there are things that need to be allowed to settle and to hurt, and you can't heal until you start to hurt properly. So a few years back, I do a lot of community arts, and I was doing a community arts workshop with some women who ended up telling anecdotes about how many times each of them had been blown up. And we got to 8, and at that point I had to excuse myself and go out to the car park to cry. And I came back and I realised that the overtelling of something can almost be a way of silencing them yourself, because they had told the same stories with humour and with, you know, the punchline in the right place so many times it no longer had the gravity that it had before. So there are ways that you can silence yourself by overtelling a story sometimes as well, and humour often comes into that mix. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm interested in, I know a lot of Northern Irish writers based here in London, and they often, there's this thing, I don't know whether you agree or not, where they kind of look at writers from the south of Ireland, and they kind of, well, I remember one person specifically being like, they're like, I wish I had the freedom to just write about whatever, but if I ever try to pitch what I write about, because of where I'm from, they kind of expect me to write about the history, the culture, and all that of Northern Ireland. And publishers specifically struggle to kind of see see a Northern Irish writer as anything other than a very kind of someone who chronicles a specific time. Is that something you can kind of understand?
Yeah, I can see it, and it's not something that I struggle with, because a lot of my work is engaging with the conflict, the repercussions, the structural issues that are still there. But I feel deep frustration for those who don't want to write about those subjects. Mm-hmm. I've just come back from France, and I was in a wonderful place called Arles in a translation centre, and I ended up talking with the 26 translators from around the world who were there about how translation sometimes does this. So there are, I read a lot of work from Latin America, and a lot of it is about drug cartels and women, violence against women, and people disappearing. Mm-hmm. And those are choices that the publishers are making as to how Argentina and Mexico and Chile is represented around the world. There are brilliant romance writers and writers who are writing about the environment and all sorts of different things from those parts of the world. It's just not been chosen to be translated. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes publishing has a big role in how people outside of a place get to see that place. And it's made me aware of it. And, Rónán's such a great advocate of translated literature. And I hope the more people who are reading in translation, the wider the scope of translation and publication might be. So it would be awful if the only thing that people were reading about the North was the same stories over and over again.
I think that that's why I'm kind of so drawn to kind of how you write and your output, in that you do, even though your stories are set in Northern Ireland, you do have that kind of, that magical realist element, which I feel, maybe it's just a kind of gap in my own reading, but I can't really think of any other writer who kind of takes that route. I feel like a lot of the writing tends to be quite realist that comes out of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a couple of essays and papers on this, and there's very little magical realism that comes out of the North in the last 50 years. Like, previously there were little shards of it. There was stuff in theatre, like, so Stuart Parker was employing a lot of magical supernatural elements in his theatre to devastating effect. I would say Stephen Saxton, the poet, is toying with magical realism in some of his writing. And I'm seeing a lot of younger writers now who are experimenting with it. It's baffling to me, based on what we talked about at the start of this chat, of we are a country with a colonial past steeped in oral storytelling, mythology, and religion. Those are all of the kind of, if you're doing a starter pack for magical realism, you've got like all the hits there. And yet we seem to have adopted this weird, like, serious matters need a serious tone, and a serious tone has to be social realism. And there's a place, a great, enormous, big place for social realism, but there's places in the canon for lots of other versions of what happened as well.
I'm intrigued by you as a writer, as someone you mentioned as a kind of, I like that you described yourself as not a short story writer, even though we're here talking about your short stories. When you have an idea, how do you know, if you're kind of in both worlds, how do you know what's going to be a novel, what's going to be a short story? Then?
Do you know what? People always ask that, and I don't know any short story writers or novelists who don't instinctively know as soon as that. It just is. It's an instinctual thing as to what's a drink and what's a food. Like, what do you pour and what do you chew? Like, for me, the short story is it's distinct from the novel for two reasons. One, it's where I get to, like, park my maddest ideas. So things that you couldn't sustain across 100,000 words. And I often come back to Richard Brautigan has an incredible 300-word microfiction about a man who replaces his plumbing with poetry. So when he turns on the tap, Emily Dickinson comes out. You wouldn't want to read 100,000 words of that. It would be a bit, but over 300 words, it's so beautiful. And so there's a space there to be really experimental in the short form. The second thing it does for me, it allows me to be selfish. When I'm writing a novel, I am always thinking about my readers. I'm thinking about how to bring them back to the text and how to keep them engaged and whether they're going to enjoy the characters. When I write a short story, I'm just thinking about me. I'm having pure fun on the page. There's a Flannery O'Connor line in Good Country People where Helga says, "If you want me, here I am, like I am." And that's how I feel these short stories are. Do you know what? If you don't like it, there's 15 more. Flick on to the next one. I'm not bothered. Or like go and buy Raymond Carver or whatever. So I get to be selfish in the short story as well.
Do you see yourself as, cause I see you as quite, your style is quite pioneering, in that you do bring that kind of an element to writing from Northern Ireland that doesn't seem to have a kind of antecedent, a kind of ancestry to it. Do you recognize that? I feel like a lot of the kind of the new generation would view as that, as someone who's really kind of breaking the mold in that way.
I don't know. I don't think so. And I think because I feel quite tapped into I mean, you can see over this weekend that Irish writing is an incredible community, and it's a supportive, nurturing community and very open to different forms of writing. But I also feel part of a bigger world community of writing, particularly since I've been translated. And there I'm not a pioneer. Mm-hmm. Mick and I, please don't feel sorry for us, but we got to go to Trinidad last year. It was a terrible, terrible gig. And there I was one magical realist among dozens and dozens, and the conversation wasn't what do the ghosts in your work represent. It was like, oh, I've got a ghost in our kitchen at home as well. So I'm not a pioneer, I'm just maybe somebody who's doing something a wee bit different in our neck of the woods.
Thank you, Jan. I'm going to ask, how are we for time over there? One more question? Okay. A nice general one then for all of you. because a question that has come up over the weekend a lot, which I think everyone is trying to get to the bottom of, basically in kind of very kind of base terms, is just why is Irish writing so amazing, basically. Why are we so great seems to be the whole point of this weekend. And it was interesting in the opening night, I don't know if any of you saw it, we had Fintan O'Toole and Louise Kennedy and Graham Norton. And not Fintan O'Toole, sorry. We had Paul Muldoon, I'm sorry. And Paul Muldoon had a very kind of gruff realist kind of way about it. People are talking about Irish people just being naturally talkative, natural storytellers. We have a way about ourselves. And his response was like, well, yeah, but that's not really unique to Ireland in any way. You could describe many nations and many cultures in the way that people tend to describe Irish writing, as the kind of like answer for why we seem to be so great. Graham Norton also had a somewhat pessimistic view, in that, a couple of years ago, Sally Rooney came onto the scene. She sold a lot of novels, and now publishing is like, oh, there seems to be something in these Irish stories that seem to sell really well. And that could also be a genuine reason for why we're seeing so many Irish writers at the moment. I don't know who wants to tackle this first. Who's brave enough to kind of have some musings on why, not even an answer, but why do people think that there seems to be such a sort of renaissance happening at the moment?
I'll give you, we don't have much time, but I'll give you a quick practical answer and then a more poetic answer. I haven't thought of the poetic one yet, but I'll just give the practical one, right? The practical one is that I think we write in English and we're not either English or American, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is a huge cultural dominance of Anglophone literature. Mm-hmm. We know that 95% of the world's population is from countries where English is not the first language. And yet that 95% makes up between 5 and 10% of sales of fiction in the UK. Huge distortion. And to back up that point, I recently, and we discussed before we came on, I recently read I Am Louis by Ono Chursk, which I think is one of the top 10 Irish novels of the 20th century. I only read it recently because it was only translated into English a couple of years ago. Mm. If it was purely down to the literary quality, you would all know Ono Chursk. And it would be taught in universities everywhere. So I think we have a huge advantage in that, but we've also made the most of it. I used to work in the national parks in Ireland, and there's a metaphor that's always stayed to me, which is that the way you basically assess the health of a habitat is its diversity, its biodiversity. So it's the number of different species that are sustained. So I think the strength of Irish writing into the future will depend on its ability to sustain diversity. Mm. We're not there yet. There isn't a huge ethnic diversity in terms of Irish literature. Place is very important. I think Irish writers, I think the current generation, all of us here, 30, if we are released at the end of the day, I think our obligation is to redefine Irish literature and not just pay homage. And I think there is a kind of lack of deference in Ireland, which is helpful to that. An iconoclastic instinct to say there are loads of great Irish writers, like I love Beckett and I love many contemporary writers, present company included, but to also say, I'm just going to strike out and do something. So I think it's a mix of all. I think it's very important we don't become sort of self-congratulatory, because actually English writing is very, very strong at the moment as well. And I think English industry is less inclined to recognise that in itself. I think the Irish, at least, there is a good community, and we're happy to kind of all move together.
Any other thoughts?
You want to go?
I think writing's taken very seriously in Ireland. It's people don't snigger if you say you're a writer or think that you're lofty or you have notions or any of those things. I think it's taken very seriously. And also I say this a lot, that the structural support, I come and talk to writers in England and they just literally sigh when they hear about what the structural supports are in Ireland. Even the fact that Culture Ireland is on the screen there as one of the contributors who facilitate. All of us have gone to places in the world because Culture Ireland makes that happen. Literature Ireland makes sure that books get translated. The Arts Council fund bursaries, and the very important literary platforms in Ireland, which are the literary journals, where loads of the seeds of young writers and the next generation coming through. But I think Rónán is absolutely right. In the future, I'm going to be really interested in the Irish-Polish writers and the Irish-Nigerian writers, but also the idea that the English that we speak, that Hiberno English that we speak, that kind of musicality that is in Irish writing, I think that's what draws people to the work. But yeah, you can't romanticize that. And I mean, I was in New Zealand this year, and there's a lot of people talking about like small nation countries, colonized countries, having your language taken from you. Oral traditions, people who can tell a 20-minute story with no notes, and then in Irish history you had the céilíoing, where you go around to a house, you get food or drink, if you could tell a really good story. You know, Irish people, they're raconteurs, they talk to old ladies at bus stops. Well, I do anyway. But do you know that kind of feeling? It's a very oral, like you can, there's smart aleck, and you can hold your own in any room in Ireland if you can tell a story, or you can make people laugh, or you just are very good at words. And that's people who don't publish books or aren't in publishing. So I think there is a kind of a reverence around the written word. It is taken seriously, even if it's funny and it's piss taking and all of those things. We just take it really seriously, and it's treated seriously. But I think, yeah, we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back too much. There's loads of wonderful cultures, and I so agree with everything that's been said about translation and what is the things we're not getting to see and read because somebody else in publishing has made that decision. So yeah, it would be lovely. It would be wonderful to see more Irish language stuff come through and get translated for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't say anything different from what these two are saying, except I really echo that thing of like, I feel like this current phase of aren't Irish writers amazing has been going for about a decade now. Peaks and troughs every 50 years, we get another kind of whoa. And it's getting to the point where it will either prove its longevity or it will become collective backpatting and just dissipate kind of thing. And to me, community is always as strong as it's kind of what's coming in and what's going out. So it's not just the kind of making space for new voices within Ireland, which I think we really need to keep working at that because it's not strong enough. It's also conversations with writers from other places and inviting them in and making sure that those borders are really porous. Because you know, we are an island. I often say we're the car park of Europe. We're tucked on the edge here. We could become an echo chamber very quickly. So it worries me when I hear people saying things like, I'm only reading Irish writers, or it's just such a joy to be in conversation with people who don't know your mother. So it's great to get out of Ireland.
I'm going to open it up to audience questions now, if anyone has a question for any of our writers at all. We need a brave first hand, and then that kind of, here we go, down at the front here.
Hi, I was just interested.
Oh wait, there'll be a microphone. Give us. Sorry.
The online people can't hear, so we just need a microphone.
Hi there. I was really interested in how the panel's been curated, actually, because it's under the banner, and Barry, you explained about folklore being perhaps somewhat uniquely Irish. I would perhaps argue that, but I wondered about the publishing between you three. I've read all three writers, and I think you perhaps had a bravery around not following the path of the Irish novel necessarily. When you spoke about there's no set place for any of your three novels. And I just wonder, is that a conscious decision? Because there must be a commercial angle in perhaps riding that Irish novel and the last 10 years of that. I wonder whether you feel any pressure as you get more commercially well known to actually link back a little bit on that, because it will suit your publisher and perhaps it'll suit your...
I don't really know what an Irish... I couldn't define what an Irish novel is for you, because I think it's a very commodious thing. It can be a lot of things. And I think also for a long time, I mean, there was a shorthand in Irish writing, and a lot of the writing that I love, again, I'm just thinking of Frank O'Connor writing about the submerged voice in his great book on the short story. There was a shorthand, you know, it was priests and alcoholism and farms and all of those things, and that was the way it was for a really long time. But it feels like lots of Irish writing now, if there is an Irish novel, is much more intersectional with the global novel and what the kind of international novel is. And I don't think you can really define what an Irish novel is, and I think all of us would never would want to bracket ourselves within it. I don't know about the two of you, how you feel about that. But it's a hard thing to describe. But I think it's really fatal in any writing, Irish or not, to try and follow a market or publish the thing that you think is going to sell. I think that's really bad news. Even if your book is, I'm trying to write what I keep calling a tiny, weird non-fiction book. I don't know if anyone want to publish it, but it's the book I want to write. And I think that should be the kind of the benchmark for how you write anything. Are you driven to write it? Don't think about anybody else. That's the only way I can write, really.
I would like to see some of the big prizes grow up and not just constantly be validating straight realism. That's just me speaking from my absolute guts. I'm 8 books in now of writing this stuff, and I guess some of the shine has come off, and I can see that some of writing like this is a little bit like career suicide. So it would be nice sometimes to see that kind of diversity of literature that is championed and read across the world reflected in some of the books that get particularly honoured in our culture here. That's maybe me being overly pessimistic, but I'm just speaking from an honest place. I'd love it if we had more Waterstones Book of the Month and shortlist for the Booker that reflected kind of a non-realist take on things.
Yeah, actually, just on that, I do wince a bit when a book is described as sort of speaking to the moment. And I remember the Nobel Committee actually didn't say it to me personally, but they were asked, someone on the Nobel Committee was asked why there hadn't been an American writer. Well, this was before Louise Gluck won. And they were saying contemporary American literature was trying too hard to chase topicality. That's a slightly different point around your one about Irishness. So if I did, wrote about a particular place in Ireland, would that give me an opening? Perhaps, I don't know. I think there is a risk. It's probably less of a risk for an Anglophone writer. I think it definitely is a risk for fiction and translation. And I've spoke to lots of people in that industry. I had met somebody this morning. We were talking about Chinese literature and the conversations they're having about what's expected, what the Western reader, what the publishing industry thinks the Western reader wants from a Chinese novel. So either science fiction or else poverty porn or some sort of, there are actually some really good books lately published around the Cultural Revolution, which, extremely good books actually in China. But I'm not sure, most of us know a lot of American cultural reference points, not many Chinese ones. And there's a sort of sense that that kind of works almost in the opposite way, that, it's more that stuff being imported into English is acceptable so long as it confirms pre-existing Western tastes. Like what you say, I think one thing, and I say particularly I admire about Jan, not that I don't admire Sinead, by the way, I have 2 kids, so I'm constantly used to having to kind of, give 50-50 thing. But I think Jan is building an important body of work. And I don't think I know what you say, in Trinidad you're kind of considered, normal. Not that we don't consider you normal, Jan.
Choose your words carefully, Rónán.
But I do think it is, and I do think it takes, there's a thing called artistic courage, which I'm only getting to learn now 3 books in, which basically means prepared to lose your readers. The courage to say, I'm really glad you liked my last book, and there's a good chance you won't like my next one, but I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah, agree.
And I think Jan, I find Jan inspiring in that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well said.
Unfortunately, I've been told we've run out of time. I'm sorry if you had questions waiting.
Come and ask at the signing.
We'll be around
you
afterwards.
can ask afterwards. Or this is what you get Irish people on a stage and we kind of don't stop talking. It seems to be the problem. But thank you so much, Sinead and Rónán and Jan, for this chat. And yeah, you're going to be signing afterwards, and any questions you can come up and pester them in real life.
We'll be happy to, yeah.
Thank you. Can I have a round of applause?
Thank you.